Hello, welcome to Social Perspective. Today we have an article saying no woman applicant for priesthood in Kerala temples. Tantra schools have not trained women in rituals till date. The article goes on saying no woman has sought appointment as priest in the temples managed by the state Devaswam boards. No woman has approached the Travancore, Cochin and Malabar Devaswam boards. Now, if you look into this article in Social Perspective, we may get reminded of the concept called stratification and mobility. In that chapter we have some concept called social exclusion, which means deprivation of economic resources or of social links with the broader society. It may be shunning some individuals or groups of individuals to earn better livelihoods by assigning some particular tasks to them, which bring them lower money or lower incomes, or shunning some certain individuals or groups of individuals to get into the mainstream society. Like we have excluded Dalits to get included into the mainstream society by cutting their social links, etc. And now this social exclusion, there is the nature of social exclusion goes on like it is systematic. That means it is a result of structural features regardless of the wishes of the excluded. Now, it does not take into consideration the wishes of the excluded. The excluded may be liking to get included into the society, but regardless of his wishes to get included into the society, social exclusion happens. That means social exclusion is systematic. It is a result of structural features like social features, maybe hierarchy or stratification in the society, economic features like industrialization, etc., political features like uh, communalism, or purposefully marginalizing certain communities for vote bank politics, etc. The reasons may be many, but social exclusion happens as it is systematic. It is regardless of the wishes of the excluded. Now we can say there is some kind of social exclusion, that is voluntary exclusion. Voluntary exclusion happens according to the wishes of the excluded only. For example, hermits or sadhus, they do not wish to get included into the mainstream society. That kind of exclusion is voluntary exclusion. However, voluntary exclusion we are not discussing in this particular article. Now, another nature is deprivation. It is deprivation is of opportunities or access. Opportunities for better livelihoods, opportunities for better education, better employment, etc. Access is to again better education facilities or better health facilities, access to temples, access to shopping malls, etc., access to social gatherings, etc. Now, other nature being prolonged exclusion leads to reaction against inclusion. Now, this is the precise reason why women are not seeking appointment as priests in the temples. We also have seen Supreme Court judgment going in favor of women's inclusion in women's entry into Sabarimala temple in Kerala. After the judgment, even in that very judgment, there was a dissenting judge who is woman, Justice Indu Malhotra, if I'm not wrong. She herself deviated from the judgment, and she dissented from the judgment. She did not like the judgment, that is women's entry into the temples. And also after the judgment, we have seen many women organizations coming out into the streets and protesting against the government and Supreme Court for women's entry into the judgment temple. They say it is against the culture. But if we look into that aspect in social perspective, that voluntary exclusion or protest against inclusion is due to prolonged exclusion. That may be expressed as reaction against inclusion. Here also, this woman not seeking appointment as priest can be perceived as reaction against prolonged exclusion. Reaction for prolonged exclusion against inclusion. And the other nature being exclusion is not always deprivation and inclusion is not always justice. The mere fact that some individuals or some groups are excluded, it does not mean that they are deprived. Also, mere inclusion does not lead to justice. We can see here, usually women do not enter the sanctum sanctorum of temples, though women were the head priests at Mannar Sala and Pambumekattu temples. Here we have seen inclusion. They have been included into the priesthood, but they have not served justice because they are not allowed to enter into the sanctum sanctorum of temples. Now, this is the classic example of exclusion is not always deprivation and inclusion is not always justice. We can quote this example in the exam. Now, if we move on, there is another article in the columns page, editorial page, talking about higher education in Kerala. This article goes on saying how higher education has been in Kerala. How is it relevant to the present society? It talks about quality of the education, and it urges about the new or upgraded education in Kerala. But in the end of the article, there is one dimension talking about women's unemployment rate. It says Kerala can take pride in the fact that out of the 3.32 lakh students in the arts and science colleges in 2019-20, 67.7% are girls and 57.2% of the teachers are women. Even so, the labor force participation rate is low and the unemployment rate of women is very high in Kerala. Judging from the larger perspective of democracy and social justice, Kerala's women do not play a critical agency role in the transformation of its economy, society, and polity. Now, this is again another classical example of saying exclusion is not always deprivation and inclusion is not always justice. Now, Kerala's women have been included for education. We can see higher inclusion rate here. 67.7% of arts and science colleges students are girls and 57.2% of the teachers are women in Kerala. But their role in socio-economic and political progress of Kerala has been minimal. That means they have been included, but justice has not been served for them. This is again a classical example of saying inclusion does not mean justice. This is the only social aspect we can observe in this article. Moving on, there is another article in the newspaper saying probe reveals mass trafficking of women from Bangladesh. It says Bangalore police uncover another prostitution rocket. If you go into the details of the article, it says hundreds of other women had been brought illegally from Bangladesh into India by traffickers. The women were allegedly brought to the country by the human trafficking gang. The traffickers had promised them good jobs, but once they arrived at a city, they were forced into prostitution. Now, if we studied this particular article, we can study this article in many social perspectives, but if we study only in social mobility aspect, what does mobility mean? It means movement of a person from one social status to another. The earlier social status may be higher or lower than the current social status. It may be same also. Based on the earlier status and the current status, that means based on the uh, relative position of status, we have two types of mobility, that is horizontal mobility and vertical mobility. If the earlier status and the current status both are equal, then it can be said as horizontal mobility. That means a person has moved from one occupation to another, but both the occupations occupy same status in the social stratification or social hierarchy. In that case, it can be said as horizontal mobility. In vertical mobility, earlier status is lower than the current status. That means there has been upward mobility. The individual has risen the ranks in the social status. There is again downward mobility, wherein earlier status is greater than the current status. That means this happens due to many factors. The individual has moved downward the ladder in social status. Now, Caldrup says mobility largely happens in the immediate ranks in the hierarchy. Largely, not very often, we'll see a person coming from very low ranks of the society getting into the higher status. It largely happens in the immediate ranks only, according to Caldrop. Now, if you people have been watching Indian Idol season 12, we have a classic singer called Savai Bhat. He comes from very low ranks in the Rajasthani society. They earn their living by Kathputli. They go into every street and they perform some arts like puppetry, singing, etc. And they earn their livelihood by begging. Now, coming from such lower rungs of the society, Savai Bhat has excelled in singing, and he has managed to get into the higher status. And now he is in top 8 among Indian Idol contestants, I guess. We all know how fierce competition Indian Idol has. Despite having no reservation, solely based on his talent and based on his abilities, he has risen the ranks in social status. Now, that is just an exception according to Caldrop. That mobility, upward mobility, does not happen in general in society or largely in society. It happens rarely according to Caldrop. but largely social mobility happens in the immediate ranks only. Now, forms of vertical mobility, if you see, it can be intergenerational or intragenerational or structural. Now, this kind of mobility, these people they have been promised good jobs, but once they are brought into the city, they are forced into prostitution. That means this is forced mobility, one thing. And the other thing is that let us assume that the earlier position of the individuals or these girls have been better than the current position. That means in that case it comes into the category of downward mobility, and it comes into the category of intragenerational, because this kind of mobility is happening within their own lifetime, not across the generations. Hence this kind of mobility is intragenerational mobility, and it comes under downward mobility. That means vertical mobility or downward mobility. Now, if we go into the causes or factors of mobility, there are four primary factors of mobility. One being demographic, that is age, sex, race, etc. The other being talent and ability. And the other faulty talent and ability, we have seen the example of Savai Bhat. He has risen the ranks and the social status solely on his talent and ability. The other factor being faulty distribution of individuals in social positions. The other factor being change of social environment. That this is major factor according to Sorokin. Change of social environment is nothing but change in policy decisions or economic environment or ecosystem, industrialization, etc. This is a major factor according to Sorokin. Now, if we see this particular example of these girls and try to categorize the causes for that mobility, we can say demographic factor is one of the reasons for their downward mobility. That means based on their age, those girls being in young age, not being on very old age, based on their sex, that means they particularly being women, and based on their race, that means they particularly being in some particular race only, they have been selected for such kind of prostitution. We cannot say that any girl of any age, of any race, is selected for prostitution, because they are in some particular kind of age, some particular sex, and some particular race. They have been selected and they have been lured by offering them better jobs. Hence, demographic factor is the reason for the downward mobility of those girls. In general, there are other factors, some being industrialization. There is Lipset Zetterberg thesis, which says industrialization has largely contributed to upward social mobility in England. Now, this is not the reason for that example, for our girls getting into prostitution example. The other factor being education. According to Duncan and Blau, education lifts many individuals from lower rungs of the society to higher status. That means upward mobility happens due to education, according to Duncan and Blau. The other factor being social capital and social status. Now there is something called closure thesis, according to Giddens and Battamore. Those occupying higher social status in the society, they try to retain that social status to their kith and kin only. That kind of because they enjoy higher social capital when compared to other members of the society. That kind of behavior or that kind of pattern is called as closure thesis. Now, again, this is also not relevant to our example. Other being occupation, yes. Those girls, they have been shifted from one occupation or no occupation to now the occupation being prostitution. Because of that shift in occupation, they have fallen in the ranks or fallen in the social status, and downward mobility happened. Again, social and cultural values, that means liberal or conservative. Partly this can also be the reason for their downward mobility. Now, let us imagine if in a society prostitution is not recorded as cheap thing, or prostitution is recognized as one of the respectable occupations just like any other occupation, then we cannot say that they faced downward mobility. We can in that situation we might have said they have faced a horizontal mobility or something else. But just because our societal values or our cultural values are against prostitution, we are saying that they have experienced downward mobility. Hence, this can also be said as one of the factors for in our example, in our article. The other factor being environmental changes. That means disasters, good rain, etc. Due to disasters, people face downward mobility very often due to loss of their property or livelihood. Due to good rains in some particular season, especially farmers and other people those who are doing job in the related activities, agriculture and related activities, they may experience upward mobility. Now again, this factor is also not relevant to our example. The other factor being social movements. These social movements like peasant movements or tribal revolts, etc., these help in collective mobility. This is not relevant. Law and constitution, that means positive discrimination or sponsored mobility, this is we called. For example, reservations to SCs and STs and OBCs in the society have helped them in their upward social mobility. However, if we indirectly analyze this particular factor, that is law and constitution, we can say that this factor also contributed for the downward mobility of our girls, whom we are discussing in that particular article. Because just because prostitution is not recognized in as per our law, and just because prostitution is criminalized in our law, we can say that those girls are experiencing downward mobility in the society. If only prostitution was recognized as per our law, and if only prostitution was decriminalized as per our legislations, we cannot say that we shouldn't have said, or we might not have said that those girls have experienced downward mobility. Hence, law and constitution also contributed for the downward mobility. The other factor being migration. Yes, they have been migrated from Bangladesh to India, and migration also contributed for their downward mobility. The other factor, physical features, that means physical looks. According to Sally Leverman, physical looks have a slightly greater edge in their mobility, that may be upward mobility or downward mobility. In this particular example, physical looks of those girls have been contributed in their downward mobility. The other factor, technological factors, that means IT, advanced technology, etc. This is, however, not relevant in our example. The other subjective factors as deemed by the society. This is again, as prostitution is deemed as a cheap labor or a cheap activity by our society, it is not regarded much value by our society. We are saying that those girls are experiencing downward mobility. Hence, subjective factors is also one of the contributing factor for downward mobility of our girls. Next one is cultural factors, that means racial or ethnic lineage. This is not relevant. Racial lineage, we can say partly, but highly it is not relevant. Political factors, we say democracy, dictatorship, theocracy, etc. Also contribute to social mobility, whether upward or downward. However, this factor is again not relevant in our example. Now, what factors are relevant in our example, or what factors have led to downward mobility of our girls? If you see, one is demographic factor, that means their age, their sex, and their race have contributed for downward mobility. And the other one is occupation, social and cultural values, law and constitution, migration, physical features, and subjective factors. All these have contributed, or all these are the factors for the downward mobility of these girls who have been promised better jobs, and they were migrated from Bangladesh to India, and after reaching India, they have been forced into prostitution, leading downward mobility of their girls, of those girls. Now that's all we have for today. If you like the content, please like, share, and subscribe to Social Perspective. Thank you and have a nice day.